fragments of books XVIII and XXXII. Then came the outbreak of the Civil War in the 88 PO, 662nd 1 year, soon after the EU, which gave rise to Rome's hatred for Mithridates. The onset of the impending troubles was portended, as Livy and Diodorus relate, by many signs. In particular, out of a clear and cloudless sky, the sound of a great trumpet was heard, prolonging a shrill and mournful note. All who heard it were beside themselves with fear, and the Etruscan soothsayers declared that the portent betokened a change in the race and a new world order. There were, they said, 8 races of men, each different from the others in manners and customs. To each of them God has assigned an age, whose completion coincides with the period of a great year. Whenever the old period draws to an end and a new one is coming to birth, some wondrous sign is sent forth from earth or heaven, whereby it is at once evident to those who are learned in such matters that men have now appeared on earth whose ways and manners are different and who are of less concern to the gods. Whether this is so or not, I omit to inquire, though the argument gains a certain plausibility from the sequel of events. Or indeed, if one considers the history of Rome from this point on, the body politic changed altogether for the worse and men of evil ways flourished. 1. Emissaries of the Roman people were sent to Cinna III to arrange a settlement. He replied, however, that since he had left the city as its consul, he did not expect to return in the status of a private citizen. 2. Later Metellus, with such forces as he still possessed, approached the encampment of Cinna, and after conferring with him agreed to recognize Cinna as consul, Metellus being the first to address him by that title. Both men were subjected to denunciation on this score. Marius, on encountering Cinna, told him to his face that, with victory all but won, he ought not to be undermining the power that the gods had granted them, while Metellus, on his return, had a violent disagreement with Octavius, who called him a traitor to the consuls and to his country. Octavius declared that under no circumstances would he allow himself and the city of Rome to fall a prey to Cinna, and even if everyone deserted him, he would still remain true to his high office, and with men of like mind would. But if he lost all hope, he would set fire to his own house and perish in the flames together with all his personal effects, and with honor intact would submit voluntarily to death while still enjoying liberty. 3. Merula? The man who had been chosen consul to replace Cinna was considered to have acted as a thoroughly good citizen would, once the agreement had been reached that he should no longer hold the consulship. Speaking both in the Senate and before the people on the best course of action for the state, he offered his services as promoter of concord, as it had been against his wishes that he was made consul. So now of his own free will he would cede the office to Cinna. So in an instant he returned to private life. The Senate then dispatched emissaries to conclude the agreement and to escort Cinna into the city as its consul. 4. Cinna and Marius met with the most eminent leaders to consider how to establish the peace on a firm basis. The decision at which they finally arrived was to put to death the most prominent of their opponents, all in fact who were capable of challenging their power. Thus, when their own party and faction had been purged, they and their friends could thenceforth conduct their administration without fear and to suit themselves. Accordingly, they immediately disregarded their sworn agreements and pledges, and the men marked for death were slaughtered right and left without a hearing. Quintus Lutatius Catulus, who had triumphed signally over the Cimbri and was held in particular affection by his fellow citizens, found himself accused before the people by a certain tribune of a capital crime. Fearing the risk involved in this legal trumpery, he turned to Marius with a request for aid. Marius, though in times past his friend, had now, because something aroused his suspicion, turned against him, and gave as his only answer, "You must die." Catulus, left with no hope of survival, but anxious to end his days without being subjected to base indignities, took his departure from life in a quite original and extraordinary manner. Locking himself in a freshly plastered room, he intensified the fumes from the lime with fire and smoke, and by suffocating himself in the noxious vapors, ended his day. 6. In consequence of their butchery of the citizens and their monstrous crimes, a divinely appointed nemesis pursued Cinna and Marius. For Sulla, their one surviving opponent, after cutting to pieces the forces of Mithridates in Boeotia and forcing Athens to capitulate, made an ally of Mithridates, and taking over the king's fleet returned home to Italy. In a trice, he smashed the forces of Cinna and Marius and brought the whole of Rome and Italy into his power. He had the whole murderous crew of Cinna's men put to the sword and utterly wiped out the Marian brood. Hence, many of the moderates imputed the punishment of the men who had inaugurated the reign of terror to the workings of divine providence, inasmuch as a most excellent object lesson had been bequeathed to those who elect an impious course, to turn them from the ways of wickedness. 7. Sulla, being in need of money, laid hands on 3 sanctuaries that possessed a wealth of offerings in gold and silver, those consecrated to Apollo at Delphi, to Asclepius at Epidaurus, and to Zeus at Olympia. His largest hall was at Olympia, since that sanctuary had remained inviolate through the ages, whereas most of the treasures at Delphi had been plundered by the Phocians during the so-called Sacred War. Sulla, by appropriating large amounts of gold and silver and any other objects of value, amassed ample funds for the anticipated war in Italy. And though he showed no scruples in seizing the sacred treasures, in their stead he did consecrate land to the gods to provide them an annual revenue. He would say in jest that his supremacy in battle was assured, since the gods, by their large contributions to his war chest, were aiding his cause. 8. During the march, Fimbria, being far in advance of Flaccus, found an opportunity to attempt great ventures, and in the interest of winning the affections of his troops, gave them license to plunder the territory of the allies as if it were enemy country, enslaving anyone they encountered. The soldiers, receiving this permission with delight, within a few days amassed much wealth. Those who had been despoiled waited upon the consul with their tale of woe. He was distressed and told them to come along with him so that they might recover their goods, and he himself ordered Fimbria, with threats, to make restitution of the plunder to those who had suffered the losses. Fimbria attempted to shift all the blame to his men, saying that they had done all they did without his approval, but privately he passed word along to his troops to pay no attention to the orders, and not to surrender what they had acquired by force of arms and under the rules of war. And when Flaccus gave even more urgent orders to return the stolen goods, and the soldiers still paid no heed, disorder and mutiny spread rampant among the host. Once across the Hellespont, Fimbria incited the troops to acts of violence and rapine, exacted money from the cities, and divided the proceeds among his men. They, raised to a position of irresponsible power, and stirred by the prospect of gain, held him dear as a public benefactor. If any cities failed to comply, he forced their surrender and turned them over to his men for plunder. Nicomedea, for example, he handed over to his troops to be plundered. This same Fimbria, after entering Cyzicus, ostensibly as a friend, brought complaints against the wealthiest men in town, charging them with certain capital offences. In order to strike fear and horror into the rest, he found 2 of them guilty and had them scourged and beheaded. Then, having confiscated their property and cowed the others by the fate meted out to his first victims, he compelled the remaining defendants to purchase their lives by surrendering their entire property to him. In a short while, Fimbria brought such disasters on the province as one might expect from a man who had resorted to such impious methods to win the power to do as he pleased. Devastating Phrygia like a hurricane, he swooped down upon the cities and overturned all who came in his path. And when at last he died by his own hand, he died but once who should have died 1,000 deaths. Gnaeus Pompey, having chosen for his career the life of a soldier, put up with its day-by-day discomforts, and soon won the highest honours for the practice of the military arts. Declining all ease and leisure, he busied himself day and night with whatever would stand him in good stead as a warrior. He kept to a spare diet, and avoided the bath and any society that entailed luxurious habits. He took his food seated, and apportioned less time for sleep than nature requires, working at night on the problems he faced by day, and spending his sleepless hours in the study of works on strategy. By this constant rehearsing of unlikely contingencies, he became a master of warfare and the art of combat. Consequently, in far less time than another man would need to take over command of an army that stood ready, he assembled an army, equipped it, and put it in battle array. When his achievements were reported in Rome, everyone at first took them lightly, considering his years rather than his ability, and assuming that the bringers of the news were idly inflating the tale with heroic pomp. But when events demonstrated the truth of the reports, the Senate sent out Iunius, whom he routed and overcame. 10. Gnaeus Pompey, whose virtues had been so richly rewarded and whose manly spirit had won him the highest laurels, achieved further success after the pattern so laid down, and apprised Sulla by letter of his growing strength. Sulla, who had on many other occasions expressed admiration for the young man, castigated the men of senatorial rank who happened to be present, holding them up to shame and at the same time exhorting them to a like zeal. It was astonishing, he said, that a mere youth could have wrested so large an army from the foe, while they, who were so far ahead of him in years and rank, had not been able to command the unfeigned support even of their own servants. 16. When the men, bribed and corrupted, had all deserted, and Scipio was left alone without hope of survival, Sulla sent horsemen to escort him safely to whatever place he desired. Thus Scipio, who in a single moment had been forced to lay aside the dignity of office for private life and a lowly status by the mercies of Sulla, was escorted to the city of his choice. Thereupon he assumed again the insignia of office and once more was in command of a large army. 11. Hadrianus, the propraetor in command at Utica, was burnt alive by the Uticans. The deed, terrible though it was, occasioned no denunciations because of the wickedness of the victim. When Marius the son of Marius became consul, not a few who had already completed their term of military service as set by law hastened of their own accord to join the young man. In the conflict, and despite their years to demonstrate to their juniors how effective long training in warfare and familiarity with battlefields and other hazards of war can be. 13. City by city and nation by nation harsh tests were applied, and attempts of many sorts to find out where men stood in regard to them. Of necessity, the people were constrained to shift the pretended loyalty that they assumed from one side to the other, and to incline toward whichever party was at hand. For representatives of the opposing belligerents assigned to the task of enlisting recruits kept appearing in person, and since they were striving to outdo one another, their highly exacting investigations brought the preference of the cities into the open. 14. As a result of the scarcity of all necessities, Marius had been deserted by his troops. Only Marcus Perpenna, the praetor of Sicily, though approached by Sulla and urged to come over to his side, was so far from complying that he not only persisted in his loyalty to Marius, but even affirmed with passion that he would cross from Sicily with all the strength at his command and rescue Marius from Praeneste. Just as the Marsic War was coming to a close, a great civil war broke out, headed by Sulla and by Gaius Marius, the young son of the Marius who had been so many times, 7 in fact, consul. In this strife many tens of thousands of men perished, but Sulla prevailed, and on becoming dictator he assumed the name of Epaphroditus, a boast in which he was not belied, since he was not belied, since he was not belied, since he was victorious in war and died a natural death. Marius put up a valiant struggle against Sulla, but was nevertheless defeated and sought refuge in Praeneste with 15,000 men. Hemmed in and subjected to a long siege, at last, when all had deserted him and he could discern no way to save himself, he was forced to call on the aid of a single faithful slave to release him from his trouble. The slave consented, and with a single stroke dispatched his master, then slew himself. Thus did the civil war end, though a few remnants of the Marian party, surviving the war, carried on the conflict with Sulla for a while, until they too perished like the rest. 17. As a result of malicious denunciations, the leading men of Rome were murdered in cold blood. Even Scaevola, who was at this time Pontifex Maximus and was held in the highest popular esteem, met a fate that ill-matched his noble nature. In one respect, at least, the Roman people were highly fortunate, namely that the supreme pontiff failed, though barely, to reach the Holy of Holies. For granted the savagery of his pursuers, he would have been murdered right at the altar of the innermost sanctum, and his blood would have extinguished the fire that through the ages has been kept alive with sleepless scrupulosity. 18. The praise of good men and the denunciation of the wicked have very great power to guide men towards noble deeds. Men who are capable of making a wise decision and of carrying their resolves to fulfillment. 19. When the prescription lists were posted in the forum, large crowds hurried to read them, and for the most part they sympathized with the men who were obliged to submit to death. One fellow in the gathering, however, a man of unusual baseness and arrogance, ridiculed the intended victims and reviled them with many a gross insult. Then and there, the retribution of some divinity imposed upon the man who mocked the lot of these unfortunates a punishment that indeed fitted his offence. Finding his own name written at the very end of the list, he at once veiled his head and rushed away through the crowd, hoping not to be noticed by those around and to make good his escape by flight. He was recognized, however, by one of the bystanders, and when the truth of his plight was disclosed, he was arrested and executed while all rejoiced at his death. 20. Inasmuch as Sicily had been without courts of law for a long period, Pompey applied himself to the administration of justice. In dealing both with public disputes and with matters of private contract, he rendered his decisions with such unerring skill and such incorruptibility that no one could hope to surpass him. Though only 22 years old, at an age when youth itself invites to the irrational pleasures, he lived during his stay on the island with such austerity and sobriety that the Sicilians were astounded and marveled at the young man's display of character. 21. The barbarian Spartacus, on receiving a certain favor from someone, showed him his gratitude. Indeed, nature is self-schooled, even among barbarians, to repay kindness for kindness to those who give assistance. 22. A victory won by force of arms brings honor and glory to officers and soldiers alike, but successes obtained through a general skill redound only to the credit of the commander. An irrepressible impulse swept over the barbarians to revolt to the Romans. As a general rule, the sufferings of others serve as a warning to those who find themselves amid similar peril. Book 37. 22. Sertorius, seeing that the movement among the natives could not be held in check, behaved harshly towards his allies. Some he arraigned and put to death, others he imprisoned, and the wealthiest he stripped of their estates. But though he amassed much gold and silver, he did not deposit it in the common war chest, but hoarded it for his own use. Nor did he provide pay for the soldiers therefrom, nor share it with the other leaders. In capital cases, he did not sit down with the council or with his advisers, but appointing himself sole judge, heard the evidence and pronounced sentence in private. At his banquets, he refused to admit the commanders and failed to show any consideration for his friends. In general, exasperated by the progressive deterioration in his position, he behaved tyrannically towards everyone. He won the hatred of the people, and his friends plotted to take his life. They succeeded in doing away with him the following way. The leaders of higher standing, Perpenna and Tarquitius, made common cause and resolved to do away with Sertorius because of his tyranny. Perpenna, chosen to head the conspiracy, invited Sertorius to dinner, and included among his guests the others who were privy to the plot. When Sertorius arrived, the conspirators set upon him, and since he had been placed at the table between Tarquitius and Antonius, it was they who slew him. Book 37. 22. As a result of a plot, Mithridates barely escaped falling into the hands of the Cyzicenes. It was a Roman centurion, working with them in their tunneling operations, who attempted to bring this about. Since these operations were being conducted on both sides and gave frequent occasion for encounters and conversations, he had become known to the king's men from his frequent talks with them. It happened once that he was left all alone on guard in the mines, and when one of the royal overseers of the work approached him with the proposition that he betray the city, he pretended to be receptive. The proposal was reported to the king, and he, in his eagerness to win control of the city, offered the man rewards and set a time for them to meet to discuss the matter. When the Roman asked to have guarantees to these promises, the king sent men to give them in his name. The man, however, insisted that he would not accept them unless he had the oaths from the king himself. The king felt that it ill became his royal dignity to descend into the mines, but since the betrayer said he would not listen to any other proposition, and the attempt to get possession of the city was a pressing concern, Mithridates was forced to accede to the demand, and the king would actually have fallen into his hands had not one of his friends, astutely surmising the Romans' intentions, devised a mechanism of just the right size that could be quickly opened and closed. This was placed in the tunnel, and when Mithridates and his friends had entered, the centurion, the men with him who were to attack the king, drawing his sword, he rushed upon the king. But the king got the door closed in time and escaped safely out of danger.